Hi, everyone. Today we are going to be going over Chapter 2, Research Ethics, particularly the considerations you need to think about when you are conducting action research. Okay, so some of the big ideas in this chapter that we're going to be thinking about during this week and for the coming weeks are some of the unique situations that teacher researchers will find themselves in. So the first one being the power dynamics. In some research, the researcher does not interact with the participants at all. However, in action research, you already have a relationship more than likely with students who are participating in your research. So this can create a host of power dynamics that they talk about in the chapter. Things like students already feeling maybe influenced from the teacher, trying to please the teacher, and trying to honor that relationship in a way that could lead to a potential imbalance. So that's definitely something to think about in your planning stages. How will you minimize your influence as the teacher over students, not just about grades, but about the relationship that you already have with students? And thinking about that relationship, you already have a sense of intimacy in the classroom. It's a classroom that you have already established, that you may have been working in for years. Some students or other colleagues or participants you might have known for years. So that can make it a bit difficult to maintain objectivity and even confidentiality. And so that's something that we're going to be getting into. I know that there have already been several comments and perusals about how do you maintain the integrity of research. As I mentioned in this chapter, and as I mentioned last week, the researcher is the primary research instrument. And so issues like your perspective or bias are certainly going to come into play. So thinking about that on the front end and planning for that in your study to think about what you will do and how you might check to maintain it. And again, we will go into some specific methods for how to do that, but thinking about that from an ethical standpoint. So that's kind of the key ideas, these two questions here, thinking about how you will balance your role as both an educator and a researcher. And how do you make sure that your action research that you are conducting for this class or in the future, after you've already finished this class and you are continuing with the practice, making sure that it does not negatively impact participants. And so in the chapter, there were several different methods, and in the case study with some examples that brought about several different discussion questions we will think about. So thinking about ethics in educational research and ethics in research broad, I'm going to talk a little bit about that just to lay the foundation of what our work is going to be like in this semester. So these principles are principles that researchers in all disciplines and all types should keep in mind. And it's something that you should be looking for when you are critiquing or evaluating research. So the end goal in research does not justify the means if it is causing undue harm. So that's something that researchers, institutional review boards, or IRBs, or reviewers are always thinking about. So in a research study, there's always a purpose, but it's important to make sure that the goal of the research is not prioritized over the well-being of participants. So thinking about that. Another thing and almost an advantage for action research is this sense of building trust. And so action research is really predicated on the trust that you have with your students or colleagues, whoever are the participants in your study. And so that makes it, of course, it's always important to be ethical in research. With action research, however, you actually know the students or people who the research could negatively or positively impact. So that's something to keep in mind as well. So in the chapter I just listed here, some of the ethical codes that they mentioned, like APA, American Psychological Association, AERA, which is American Educational Researchers Association, that guides all of us who do educational research. And then this National Research Act of 1974 that was really foundational in creating the IRBs that we have today and a lot of our understandings and some of the main ways that we think about research. And we'll talk a little bit more about how that came to be too. So you see here the date of 1974, and in the text, they mention briefly that there were two major studies that led to this National Research Act that is still in effect today and guiding our research. So the text briefly mentioned the US syphilis study, but I wanted to talk a little bit more about it because this study has a major impact on our society and is something to keep in mind in all types of research. So the US syphilis study, as you can see here, it started in 1932 and the study went on for 40 years. And the goal of this study was to understand the disease of syphilis. And so they recruited in the study over 600, about 600 African-American men who had syphilis to participate. Now, at the time that the study started and throughout the course of the study, there was not informed consent. And on top of that, the participants were not told about the purpose of the study, so there was deception there. And most harmful is that the participants were not given medical treatment. So they were recruited for the study because they were known to have syphilis. However, the researchers studied their condition and failed to give any type of medical help. And this is even the case after penicillin was discovered. I forget what year that was, but over the course of the 40 years, penicillin was discovered to be a cure, and that was also withheld for participants. And so this had longstanding effects. It's, as you can see, over 100 participants died. And not only that, spouses were impacted and children as well. So this study, once it was revealed in a newspaper expose in the early 70s, there was a national outcry and a need for more robust standards in research. And so we still see that today, and it's still something that is an ongoing process because the impact of unethical research has long-standing impacts. So here I have a few statistics from a more recent study conducted in from Stanford that looked at the impact of the US syphilis study, finding that it has impacts even today on the health of Black men and how they drew these clear lines between the study and how that affects attitudes and unfortunately mistrust today amongst African-American men and healthcare providers. So it's a really interesting study. I'm going to put the link in the perusal if you are interested in reading more about the Stanford researchers and some of their work that they are doing to combat some of the negative impacts of this study. So some of the key takeaways were, of course, informed consent. Like I mentioned, the participants, they did not know the purpose of the study, and they were not adequately informed of what the potential consequences were, the potential risks. And then equity and fairness. The participants of this study were targeted. At the time, they were poor Black men, and they did not have the social capital to protect them from such predatory research. So that's always something to look out for and to give a second look to, is issues of equity and which groups are being included in research and why. And then also preventable harm. So there were deaths in this study that were preventable. And that is going back to the previous point, the goal of the research in no way necessitates this preventable harm that was there. So this is a very important piece in the history of research. Educational research as well is very impacted by this, and the creation of IRBs that are discussed in this chapter. So IRB's institutional review boards are held at a host of different institutions. So universities like Georgia State has an IRB. Also, private corporations could have an IRB. Schools like public school districts could have IRBs, and other maybe like research boards, maybe a medical facility could have an IRB as well, like a hospital, things like that. So the role of IRB is to review research before it is conducted to make sure that it upholds the values of ethical research and to protect participants who are involved in the research. So when you are teacher researchers, you are in a sometimes unique situation if you are doing research on your job that you already normally do. And that's something that is talked about in the chapter. If your research is not something necessarily different that you are doing on a day-to-day basis. And so within the IRB at Georgia State, it has things like informed consent. You have to submit a copy of what your consent procedures will be, making sure that you are not coercing participants to be involved in the study, thinking about the power dynamics that are there, and then also that you are going to be clear about the risks and potential benefits, so they can consider that. So at Georgia State, we do have an IRB. And so it mentioned in our text that different schools or universities have different standards. Their IRBs have different requirements for action research. So here are Georgia State University's requirements for action research. So sometimes action research is required, or sometimes IRBs are required for action research. So in those cases, the research is going to be used for a dissertation or a thesis, and it is going to be published, even if it's just published in the Georgia State repository where we have papers. Or if you're going to use it in a formal presentation, like at an academic conference or a professional conference. So those are the instances when you will need IRB approval. Now, according to Georgia State's IRB, you do not need IRB if you're doing action research for just your personal teaching improvement. So if you're using action research, how some of you have already mentioned that you're planning to use it to reflect, improve your practice, and you're not planning to publish it, then you do not need IRB approval. And you also do not need it if you are only sharing the data informally with other teachers, like your colleagues at your school, or with like me as your instructor, or your classmates who are taking this class with you. So as long as the data stays within the school, or it's presented only to Georgia State students and faculty, like you are doing in this class. So in most cases for what you're planning for this class, you will not need to undergo Georgia State IRB. Now, if you want to, I can definitely help guide you through that. I'll put a link for Georgia State's IRB also in Perusall if you want to go there and create a login. There's also required training that you need to do, and that's something that I can help guide you through outside of the scope of what's required for this class. So again, for most purposes for this class, you will not need to do an IRB to carry out your study. So again, if it's focused on trying to improve your practice and you're keeping it here within our class or your school, you do not need it. Okay, so I pulled this quote out of the text. I thought that it was really powerful in thinking about action research and ethics in action research. So, of course, studying your own practice. And then this part right here. So you're not only acting as researchers, but also as change agents with the power to bring about change into your classroom. And so, and I know I kind of mentioned this in the last lecture. So particularly if you are thinking about it from the lens of a critical action research perspective, and even if you're not, you still need to consider from an ethical standpoint that you are in a position to influence students and make a positive change or a negative change. So with that comes a great responsibility. And so thinking about that, reflecting not just about your practice, and that's something I wish that they had more of in the chapter as well, because as teachers, there's so many ethical dilemmas and issues, decisions that we make every single day. And so thinking about that parallel to your identity as a researcher is really powerful, particularly when thinking about it like this as change agents. And so I'm sure there's many instances where there's overlap in thinking about the ethical responsibilities of a teacher and as a researcher, and many intersections there. But thinking about it as having this great responsibility, And then two, with the action research cycle, not just collecting the data and analyzing it, but taking that step based on what you've learned from the data as being an ethical situation to be in. So I really liked this quote. It's probably something that we'll be coming back to throughout as we continue to design our studies. So this was the case study that they gave in the chapter, at the beginning of the chapter at Billabong Elementary and using technology. And it brought about some ethical issues that you may not have thought of, namely being when data is collected that is unexpected and perhaps unflattering. And this is, I think, something probably relatable for a lot of schools. You know, anytime you are involved in anything that is relational, like teaching, there are strengths and areas of growth at all times. So that was kind of the main ethical dilemma here. And so how did they navigate being a change agent and using this responsibility and the power to enact the change that they kind of know needs to happen while still protecting the professional relationships that they had, and then also keeping the, you know, things like keeping teacher morale up and making sure that trust was not broken. And so I am anxious to hear your comments on their solutions and what you thought about that, or if there's other ethical issues that they didn't mention that you thought of as well. So this one had to do with ethics when it comes to conducting action research amongst adults or colleagues. But there may be some things that could occur, of course, when you are conducting action research with children or students. Okay, so thinking about that and some of the issues in the case study. So these are some of the common guidelines for action research is informed consent, formal or informal. So I mentioned that in most cases in this class, you will not need Georgia State IRB approval. However, in the chapter and and maybe based on some of your own readings, informed consent, either informal might be a good idea for you to maintain those relationships and the trust and the transparency that you are hoping to achieve in your teaching and your research. So making sure that participants understand what you are doing, why, and how it impacts them, and then also how it impacts their data. So of course, confidentiality and anonymity, thinking about those two elements, making sure that you have a plan for that and you clearly thought through which one is realistic for your study and how you will protect participant identities and any data that you collect. Avoiding harm, even if it is unintentional, being very proactive to think through what potential harm could be, how that could happen, what it might be, and what you would do in those cases, and what you could do to mitigate some potential harm that could impact your participants. Emotional harm, of course, physical harm, but thinking about too, like mental health and emotional well-being, academic well-being is also important. And then this idea of justice, coming back to the background about what led to these ethical principles and some of the injustices that happened in prior research and that probably still do happen in some cases today, where certain vulnerable populations are targeted for research because they are not protected. And it is an instance of society kind of taking advantage of groups of people. So thinking about that even on a school level too, which students are chosen for research, why, and how are we making sure that we are enacting the principles of equity that we are hoping to uphold in our classrooms and in our research. So when we think about ethics and research and the principle of justice, the theory is that we want to equally distribute the burden of research across social groups, race, economic status, gender, being imprisoned or not imprisoned, sheltered, unsheltered, the burden across our society. And then also of course, this is for all research. So thinking about like medical research and the implications for that. So speaking of informed consent, I wanted to offer this resource for you. I know this is hard to see. I apologize for that, but I will put a link in perusal where you can go to this website and you can access these various templates if you're interested. So thinking about informed consent, of course, it's not something required for you based on Georgia State's IRB, but it is something that you may want to include in your plan and your practice. So there is also a difference between an informed consent letter and then an informational letter. So informed consent is when you are informing, giving the details about the study, the purpose, the risks, the benefits, how data and privacy is going to be maintained. And then that's when participants would sign that they agree. And then an informational letter is when you don't need consent. And you are just informing them of what you are doing. So the source, oh, I'm sorry, this is blank, but the source for this is the Center for Collaborative Action Research, which the website has a host of information. So I will put the link to that. And then they have some various templates that you can take a look at to get a feel for some of the verbiage that you might use with your students, with your principal, with your colleagues, with your team. I saw a lot of people in Perusal were already saying, oh, I can't wait to tell my colleagues about this, my team about this, my department about this. So these hopefully will be helpful. And when you are thinking about your study, once we get into planning it, thinking about informed consent versus informational letter, namely based on the type of data you are collecting. Of course, anything like a photograph or a video, you would want to get consent for that. And then if you are collecting data that is de-identified, you've removed students' names, it in no way could be connected to them, an informational letter might more so be appropriate. Okay, so coming back to those ideas of confidentiality versus anonymity. So confidentiality is more common in action research because that is when the researchers know the identity of participants, but they keep them private. So what that means is they don't include any identifiable information connected to their data. They don't use their name, they don't use descriptors, they don't use the location of the school, like in a publication. Of course, that's a bit more challenging for us. And some of you might even know each other and work in the same school. So that could definitely create a challenge for confidentiality. So if you are including confidentiality in your study, that's something to think through before you begin data collection. How will you keep the identities of participants private? How will you make sure there's no identifiable information connected to the data that you collect? The text also mentions pseudonyms here. That's sometimes things that researchers use instead of using the student's actual name to use a pseudonym. Now, anonymity is when the researcher does not know the identity of the participants. And so they might know the participant's identity, but they don't know that that data belongs to that participant. So I'm sure there's situations, and you might have some here, but this would be like if you had a set of, like some pre-test scores and some post-test scores, and there was no handwriting, no name, you just had averages, and so you just looked at the class average, and you weren't able to tell what individual students did. That might be anonymity. So making sure that you are using the right terminology there and that you have a plan to protect the data, thinking about where you will keep the data, and even in a classroom setting, students are around each other, and so keeping data private even from other students as well is something to think about, or other teachers that they might have. Okay, so we talked about informed consent. So When you are using informed consent or an informational letter, making sure that you are being transparent and disclosing the purpose of the research. And also comprehension, the informed consent, this is another equity issue. It needs to be comprehensible to whoever your participants are. So thinking about the reading level and the age of the participants. Now, this voluntariness. And that was mentioned in the text too. I'll come back to that on our graphic on the last slide. It's important for participants to know that their participation is voluntary and making sure that you're not using your power to coerce them or influence them into participating. And not only that, participants can decide at any time that they no longer want to participate. And when that happens, you don't use the data you've already collected for them. So that's something to reiterate to students, your principal, or whoever you need to inform about that. Again, this is something I've talked about a lot, is how are you going to navigate that sense of obligation, and making sure that students are not agreeing, even though they don't want to, because to honor your relationship. And they had some great ideas in the text about how you might go about making sure that students don't feel the social pressure to participate and how they can do that. We talked about privacy. Oh, and then this was the point that I just made about, like, in a small setting, making sure that the data is not, left on a desk or somewhere where others could access it. Okay, so this is thinking back to our case study, and once you start to think through it. So and kind of the note that I already mentioned about how teachers are constantly thinking through ethical dilemmas, same thing for researchers. And this is something that you are thinking about, of course, before you plan the study, before you when you're getting approval to do the study, but also during the study too, when things come up. And then I really liked how the case study kind of dealt with this topic of dealing with negative findings. So thinking about that on the front end, what potential negative findings could happen? What would you do? And then your ethical obligations, and how you will navigate that, being, of course, transparent, but then also protecting participants from harm. And then lastly is professional integrity is another component of ethics. And this is something you can take with you into all of your classes throughout your program. This idea of professional integrity, academic integrity is guided really by two things: the social principles, and then the ethical conduct, and then your honest reporting. So making sure that your data is accurate. And this is making me think about too, the point being made about bias. And so when you are researching yourself in your own practice, of course, you are looking at it from the person who designed it and carried it out and is now reflecting upon it. So thinking about how you can make sure that you're being accurate about your data. And this is something too that's very relational. With students, you might say, oh, this score isn't reflective of, them. This is kind of an outlier. So thinking about how you will challenge yourself to keep the data accurate. Of course, that sounds simple, but in teaching, in a research, it's not that simple. And so thinking about that and being aware of that. And then when those moments pop up, you can think back to this, and then being honest. And then making sure that you're supporting the well-being of the community, and then transparency in the findings. And that's something that was discussed in the case study as well. And then the social principles that guide you if you're doing critical action research, and if you're not, there's still many social principles that are guiding you, your beliefs as an educator. That's something that we've been reflecting about last week. We will continue to do so. Your beliefs about a democratic process and the importance of research and education. We talked about fabrication or bias. And then thinking about how you would go about reporting your results, honestly, even if they challenge your personal belief. And so that's something too that was mentioned in action research is, your research project is going to reflect your values as an educator. And so collecting data that is in contrast with what you believe or thought you believed can be quite challenging. And so thinking about how you might overcome that. Okay, I really think that we've been through all of this. So just a review of that, and you have the summary. And then I will leave you with this checklist as you move into your reflection about this chapter and about your practice. So the first one, I should have put this. We already did number one. You do not need IRB for Georgia State. And so therefore, you don't need to obtain it unless you are interested in publication, and let me know. And then the rest of these are things that you will think about once you start to plan your study. So we will come back to them. So in the meantime, you can start to think about some of the terms here, like confidentiality, avoidance of harm, and the broader social issues that impact your research. So I'm looking forward to seeing your reflections on this, and please leave any questions for me in Perusall.